The Great Council Chamber of Zephyria Prime hummed with nervous energy as delegates from across the galaxy gathered for the emergency session. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zolonian Empire adjusted his ceremonial robes, the fabric shimmering with embedded starlight patterns that marked his noble status. Around him, representatives from dozens of species filled the crystalline amphitheater, their varied forms creating a tapestry of galactic civilization. At the center of the chamber stood the keeper of ancient records, an elderly Vorthak whose skin bore the pale blue tinge of extreme age. Her forearms trembled slightly as she held the obsidian tablet, its surface carved with symbols older than most civilizations present. Honored delegates, the keeper began, her voice carrying the weight of millennia, I have called this assembly to share a discovery that may determine the fate of our galaxy. During routine archival work in the deepest vaults of Zirion, we uncovered warnings left by the precursors themselves. A murmur rippled through the assembly. The precursors had vanished over 50,000 years ago, leaving behind only scattered ruins and technologies that current civilizations could barely comprehend. Finding intact records from their era was unprecedented. Ambassador Kethvar leaned forward in his seat. What manner of warnings, Keeper? The precursors faced no enemies capable of threatening their dominion. The Keeper's large, multifaceted eyes fixed on him. That is where you are mistaken, Ambassador. They faced something that made even their advanced civilization tremble. They called them the Children of Soul, or in their ancient tongue, humanity. Scattered laughter echoed through the chamber. Commander ZYX of the Hegemony Military Council, a massive insectoid being, clicked his mandibles in amusement. Keeper, with all due respect, we are familiar with humans. They are a young species, barely 3 centuries into space travel. Their technology is primitive compared to ours. They pose no threat to civilized space. Their ships are crude metal constructs, added Trade Minister Veltar of the Commerce Syndicate. They still use chemical propulsion and primitive energy weapons. My cargo haulers are more advanced than their military vessels. The Keeper raised one of her hands for silence. Then, you have not truly studied them, honored delegates. Listen to what the precursors recorded. She began to read from the ancient tablet, her voice taking on a haunting cadence. Beware the sleeping fury of the third world. Its children walk in flesh that seems weak, but harbors a spirit that burns brighter than stars. We thought to test them, to see if they might join our grand design. We were fools. Their rage, once awakened, consumes all reason. They do not fight as we fight, with calculation and strategy. They fight as forces of nature fight, with terrible purpose and no regard for their own existence. The laughter died away, replaced by uncomfortable silence. Ambassador Kethvar shifted in his seat. Even if this translation is accurate, Keeper, you speak of events from the distant past. Humanity has evolved since then. They have become civilized, peaceful traders and explorers. Have they? The Keeper touched another section of the tablet. The precursors left detailed observations. Shall I continue? Without waiting for an answer, she read on. We believed their scattered tribes and primitive technology made them harmless. When our survey fleet arrived at their world, they greeted us with curiosity rather than fear. We saw this as evidence of their weakness. How wrong we were. When we attempted to claim their moon as a research station, they did not surrender as logic dictated. They did not negotiate as rational beings should. They simply said no, and meant it with every fiber of their being. Captain Mordek of the Territorial Defense Force, a reptilian saurian, hissed softly. One world defying the precursors? Impossible. Their fleets numbered in the millions. The Keeper's expression grew grave. The tablet speaks of what followed. We expected swift compliance. Instead, they fought. Not as armies fight, with grand strategies and careful preservation of resources, but, as cornered beasts fight, with everything they possessed. Their primitive rockets carried bombs that cracked our hulls. Their fragile fighters rammed our vessels when their weapons failed. They died by the millions, and each death only made the survivors fight harder. A chill settled over the chamber. These were species that had never known true desperation, never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice everything for victory. But, surely, Ambassador Kethvar said, his voice less certain now, the precursor's superior technology eventually prevailed? The Keeper turned the tablet, revealing symbols that seemed to pulse with dark meaning. Listen to their final entry about humanity: we won every battle yet lost the war. For every human ship we destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every city we conquered, they built weapons in the ruins. They learned our technology faster than we thought possible, not through study but through desperation. By the war's end, their captured vessels fought alongside their crewed rockets. They had become something we had not seen in a million years of conquest, an enemy that grew stronger through defeat. Trade Minister Veltar's skin changed to a pale yellow, indicating distress among his species. How did the war end? Did the precursors destroy them? No. The Keeper's simple word hung in the air like a death sentence. The precursors retreated. The most advanced civilization in galactic history, beings who had conquered 1,000 worlds, withdrew from one small blue planet. But not before recording their final warning. She read the closing passage, her voice barely above a whisper. We leave this warning for those who come after. The children of Soul appear weak, their flesh soft, their weapons primitive. But, beneath that fragile exterior burns a fury that once awakened cannot be quenched. They do not fight for glory or conquest as we do. They fight for survival, for each other, for ideas they hold more precious than their lives. Should anyone be foolish enough to threaten their home, their families, or their freedom, they will discover what we learned too late, that there are fates worse than death, and one of them is facing humanity's wrath. The chamber fell completely silent. Even the subtle hum of the station's systems seemed muted. Finally, Commander ZYX spoke, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. These are ancient records, Keeper. Perhaps the translation is flawed, or the precursors exaggerated their encounter. Perhaps, the Keeper agreed. But, I have spent 3 centuries studying precursor texts. They were not given to exaggeration or embellishment. They recorded facts with mechanical precision. If they left warnings about humanity, we would be wise to heed them. Admiral Fex of the Core World's Defense Fleet, a being whose crystalline form reflected light in complex patterns, chimed his response. Even accepting these records as truth, we are not the precursors. We have studied humanity for decades. They are traders, explorers, scientists. They have shown no aggressive tendencies toward galactic civilization. Because no one has given them reason to show such tendencies, the Keeper replied. The precursor's warning is clear: human fury must be awakened before it becomes dangerous. As long as they are left in peace, they remain peaceful. But, if threatened. Ambassador Kethvar stood, his robes rustling. With respect, Keeper, I find it difficult to believe that one species, no matter how determined, could pose a serious threat to galactic civilization. We have hundreds of species in the Council, millions of ships, technologies beyond human comprehension. The precursors thought the same, the Keeper said quietly. They had technologies we can barely replicate today, yet they fled from one world of angry humans. Captain Mordek's forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air for chemical signs of deception. Finding none, he settled back uneasily. What does the Council propose we do with this information? Shall we preemptively strike against humanity? That would certainly awaken this supposed fury. No, the Keeper said firmly. The precursor's warning is not to attack humanity, it is to never give them reason to attack us. As long as they are content in their small corner of space, trading and exploring in peace, they pose no threat. The danger comes if anyone threatens their core worlds or their people. Trade Minister Veltar's tentacles writhed nervously. But, what of expansion? Human colonies spread further each year. Eventually, they will encounter territorial disputes with established powers. Then, those disputes must be resolved peacefully, the Keeper emphasized. The precursors learned that human rationality disappears when they perceive an existential threat. They become something else entirely, something that fights not to win but to ensure their enemy loses everything. Commander ZYX clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. You speak as if they undergo some sort of transformation. The Keeper nodded gravely. The precursors described it in their tactical analyses. Normally, species fight to achieve objectives, territory, resources, political goals. When those objectives become impossible to achieve, rational beings surrender or seek terms. Humans do not. When facing extinction, they fight to drag their enemies down with them. The precursors called it mutually assured destruction, but it goes deeper than that. It becomes a fundamental rejection of defeat, regardless of cost. The chamber erupted in discussion as delegates turned to confer with their advisors. The concept was alien to most galactic civilizations, which had developed complex protocols for honorable surrender and negotiated settlements. War was typically a tool of politics, not an existential struggle. Admiral Thex's crystalline form rang like a bell as he called for attention. "Honored Keeper, you paint a disturbing picture. But humanity has been part of galactic society for over 2 centuries. They have participated in trade agreements, scientific collaborations, even minor territorial disputes. In all that time, they have shown themselves to be reasonable and diplomatic. Because their fundamental interests have never been truly threatened," the Keeper replied. The precursors noted this pattern. Humans can be the most reasonable beings in the galaxy until they cannot be. The transformation happens when they perceive threats to their core worlds, their families, or their way of life. Then, reason abandons them, replaced by something the precursors could only describe as sacred rage. Ambassador Kethvar frowned. Sacred rage? An odd term for a military analysis. The precursors were thorough in their observations. They noted that human warriors entering this state often spoke of fighting for concepts rather than objectives. Home, family, freedom, ideas that cannot be negotiated or compromised. An enemy might offer a human warrior all the wealth in the galaxy, but if he believes his family is threatened, he will die before accepting. Captain Mordek's scales rippled with unease. Such irrationality would be a tactical disadvantage. Predictable behavior patterns make for easier opponents. That was the precursors' initial assessment, the Keeper agreed. They planned their campaigns around human predictability, expecting them to surrender when losses became unsustainable. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that became more dangerous as it approached defeat. Cornered humans, according to these records, fight with creativity born of desperation and fury that ignores pain and exhaustion. The debate continued for hours, but gradually a consensus emerged. Whether or not the ancient warnings were accurate, the potential consequences of testing them were too severe to ignore. Better to maintain peaceful relations with humanity than risk awakening whatever darkness the precursors had encountered. As the session concluded, Ambassador Kethvar approached the Keeper privately. "Do you truly believe these warnings, or are you simply being cautious?" The elderly Vorthak studied the obsidian tablet for a long moment. "I have read every precursor text discovered in my lifetime, Ambassador. They were the most powerful civilization in galactic history, yet they left only one warning about a specific species. That alone should give us pause. But humanity seems so ordinary. Their ships are functional but unremarkable. Their technology advances steadily but not dramatically. What could make them so dangerous?" The Keeper's 4 arms gestured to encompass the chamber around them. "Look around you, Ambassador. We have built a civilization based on reason, compromise, and mutual benefit. We fight when necessary, but always with objectives in mind. We surrender when the cost becomes too high because there are always alternatives to extinction." She paused, her multifaceted eyes reflecting the chamber's soft light. The precursors discovered that humans operate under different rules. For them, some things are worth any cost. They do not view death as the ultimate evil if it serves to protect what they value most. That makes them unpredictable, uncontrollable, and ultimately unstoppable once their fury is awakened. Ambassador Kethvar left the chamber with much to consider. The galaxy had enjoyed peace and prosperity for millennia, built on the foundation of rational beings making rational decisions. The thought that one species might operate outside those parameters was deeply unsettling. Unknown to the council delegates, their discussion had been monitored by automated systems throughout the galaxy, including a small relay station on the edge of human space. The conversation would soon reach Earth's intelligence services, where analysts would struggle to understand why ancient aliens had apparently fled from their ancestors. But that understanding would come later, when circumstances forced humanity to remember capabilities they had hoped never to use again. For now, they remained peaceful traders and explorers, content in their corner of the galaxy, unaware that their very presence made elder civilizations nervous. The precursors' warning lay buried in archives once more, but its echoes would ripple through galactic politics in the years to come, as powers began to wonder what sleeping fury might dwell within their human neighbors. 3 years had passed since the revelation of the precursor warnings, and the galaxy had settled into an uneasy routine. Most species continued their interactions with humanity as before, though with subtle changes that the humans themselves barely noticed. Trade negotiations took slightly different tones. Military exercises avoided human space by wider margins. Diplomatic protocols included new clauses about avoiding provocative actions. Captain Sarah Chen of the UES Prometheus stood on her ship's bridge, reviewing the latest cargo manifest. The Prometheus was a typical human vessel, functional rather than elegant, built for reliability over aesthetics. Its hull bore the scars of countless journeys through asteroid fields and solar storms, repairs patched over repairs in the practical manner that characterized human engineering. Captain, called Lieutenant Commander Jackson from the communications station, were receiving a distress signal from the Kepler 442 system. "It's coming from New Geneva colony." Sarah's expression hardened. New Geneva was one of humanity's newest settlements, barely 5 years old and home to nearly 2 million colonists. Most were families seeking fresh starts on a world that reminded them of old Earth, with vast oceans and temperate continents perfect for agriculture. "What's the nature of the emergency?" Sarah asked, moving to Jackson's station. "Signal's pretty broken up, but it sounds like they're under attack. Multiple hostile vessels, overwhelming firepower." Jackson's fingers flew over his console, trying to clean up the transmission. "Wait, I'm getting clearer reception." The voice that filled the bridge carried barely controlled panic. "Repeat, this is Governor Martinez of New Geneva colony. We are under attack by unknown vessels. They appeared without warning and began bombardment of our orbital stations. Colonial Defense Force is vastly outgunned. Request immediate assistance from any ships." And the transmission cut to static. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. New Geneva had no strategic value, no rare minerals, no strategic location, nothing that would make it worth attacking except for the people who lived there. "Jackson, get me Admiral Morrison at Fleet Command. Emergency priority." "Aye, Captain." While Jackson worked to establish the connection, Sarah stared at the tactical display showing the Kepler 442 system. It lay at the very edge of human space, barely defended and far from any major shipping routes. Why would anyone attack such a target? Admiral Morrison's grizzled face appeared on the main screen within minutes. The old man looked like he hadn't slept in days, and Sarah realized this might not be the first bad news he'd received. "Chen," Morrison said without preamble, "how fast can you get to Kepler 442? 18 hours at maximum burn, sir." "Admiral, what's happening out there?" Morrison's expression darkened further. "We're not sure yet. 3 human colonies have been attacked in the past week. The pattern doesn't make sense. They're all agricultural worlds with minimal defenses. No strategic value, no resources worth fighting over." "Pirates?" Sarah suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. "Pirates don't move in fleets of 50 ships, Captain. And they don't waste ammunition on civilian targets when there's nothing to steal." Morrison rubbed his eyes. "We've lost contact with all 3 colonies. No survivors, no witnesses, no clear indication of who's responsible." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "Orders, sir? Get to New Geneva with everything you've got. The Stalingrad and the Churchill are already en route, but you'll arrive first. Try to get some intelligence on who's doing this." Morrison paused. "And, Chen? Be careful. Someone's testing us, and I don't like the implications." The connection ended, leaving Sarah staring at a blank screen. She turned to her bridge crew, all of whom had heard the exchange. Their faces showed the same mixture of anger and determination she felt building in her chest. "Helm, set course for Kepler 442, maximum burn," she ordered. "All departments, battle stations. We're going to war." As the Prometheus accelerated toward the threatened colony, similar conversations were taking place throughout human space. The destruction of 3 agricultural worlds had sent shockwaves through Earth's government and military leadership. For the first time in over 2 centuries, human civilians were being murdered by an unknown enemy. President Elena Vasquez stood in the Situation Room beneath the presidential palace in Geneva, surrounded by the heads of Earth's military and intelligence services. The wall display showed the locations of the attacked colonies, their positions forming a rough arc along the edge of human territory. "Talk to me," she said to Admiral Sarah Hayes, the stern woman who commanded Earth's Colonial Defense Force. "What are we dealing with?" Admiral Hayes gestured to the tactical display. "Someone with serious firepower and no apparent political objectives. The attacking fleets appear suddenly, bombard everything in sight, then disappear. No demands, no warnings, no attempts at communication.
Could this be a xenophobic campaign? Asked Director Williams of Colonial Intelligence. Some species trying to push humans back from the frontier? Possible, Hayes replied, but the timing is suspicious. These attacks began shortly after intelligence reports suggested increased chatter about humanity in several council chambers.
Something has the major powers nervous about us.
President Vasquez frowned. Nervous about us? We're barely a mid-tier civilization. What could we possibly do to threaten the established powers?
I don't know, Madam President. But someone clearly believes we're dangerous enough to test our responses to civilian casualties. The discussion was interrupted by an urgent communication from Fleet Command. Admiral Morrison's face appeared on the central screen, his expression grim.
Madam President, Morrison began, I have updates from the Kepler 442 system.
Captain Chen arrived to find New Geneva under assault by a fleet of unknown configuration. She engaged the enemy and managed to drive them off, but not before they completed their bombardment. The room fell silent. President Vasquez felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the same fury that had driven her ancestors to fight against impossible odds throughout human history.
Casualties? She asked, though she already knew the answer would be devastating.
Preliminary reports suggest total loss of civilian population, Morrison said quietly.
Nearly 2 million men, women, and children. The colony's infrastructure is completely destroyed.
President Vasquez closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those deaths settle on her shoulders. When she opened them, something had changed in her expression. The diplomatic mask she wore in galactic forums had fallen away, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Admiral Hayes, she said, her voice carrying new authority, I want every ship we have protecting our remaining colonies. No one else dies while we figure out who's responsible.
Yes, Madam President. Director Williams, I want our intelligence networks activated. Find out who's behind these attacks and why. Use any resources necessary. Understood.
President Vasquez turned to face the entire room.
Ladies and gentlemen, someone has just murdered 4 million human beings.
They've attacked our families, our children, our civilians who pose no threat to anyone.
That changes everything.
She walked to the display showing the destroyed colonies, each red marker representing hundreds of thousands of lives cut short. For over 2 centuries, we've played by galactic rules. We've been peaceful traders, careful not to provoke or threaten our neighbors. We've accepted our position as a minor power and worked within the system. Her voice grew harder. But the system has failed to protect our people.
Someone out there believes they can murder humans without consequences. They're about to learn they're wrong. Admiral Hayes leaned forward. What are your orders, Madam President? Full military mobilization.
Activate all reserve fleets.
Recall our exploration vessels. Cancel all non-essential trade missions. Vasquez's eyes swept the room. Until we find the people responsible for these attacks, Earth is on a war footing.
The implications of that statement rippled through the room. Earth's military, while competent, had been designed for defensive operations and peacekeeping. Full mobilization meant transforming the entire economic and industrial base to support military action, something humanity hadn't done since the early colonial wars.
Madam President, Director Williams said carefully, a mobilization of that scale will be noticed throughout the galaxy. It might provoke the very conflict we're trying to avoid.
Vasquez turned to face him, and Williams took an involuntary step back at what he saw in her eyes.
Director, someone has already provoked that conflict. They did it when they decided human lives were expendable.
She returned her attention to the wall display. I don't care if mobilization makes our neighbors nervous. I don't care if it changes their perception of humanity. Someone murdered our people, and we're going to find them. When we do, they're going to learn that there are consequences for attacking human civilians.
Across the galaxy, Ambassador Kethvar was receiving his own disturbing intelligence reports. The Zolonian Empire's spy networks had detected the massive mobilization taking place throughout human space.
What concerned him most wasn't the scale of the mobilization, it was the speed. In less than 72 hours, humanity had transformed from a peaceful trading civilization into something resembling a military juggernaut.
Reserve fleets that had been mothballed for decades were coming online.
Industrial facilities were retooling for military production.
Most disturbing of all, human civilian populations were supporting these measures with an enthusiasm that bordered on frightening.
He remembered the Keeper's warnings about awakening humanity's fury and felt a chill run through his scaled hide. Someone had attacked human civilians, and now the galaxy was about to see what the precursors had faced 50,000 years ago. On the bridge of the UES Prometheus, Captain Sarah Chen was discovering the first hints of what her species was capable of when truly threatened. As she surveyed the devastated remains of New Geneva Colony, something fundamental had changed in her understanding of her mission. For her entire career, she had been an explorer and protector, trained to avoid conflicts and resolve disputes peacefully. She had taken pride in humanity's reputation as reasonable, diplomatic members of galactic civilization. But, as she looked at the wreckage of homes where families had lived and worked, at the twisted remains of schools where children had played, she felt something awakening in her chest that had nothing to do with reason or diplomacy. It was older than civilization, deeper than training, and more powerful than any weapon in her ship's arsenal. It was the fury the ancients had warned about, and it was spreading through human space like wildfire. The enemy had made their first mistake by attacking human civilians. They were about to discover that some species should never be cornered, never be threatened, and never, ever be given reason to abandon their civilized restraint. Humanity was about to remember why the precursors had fled.
Captain Chen opened a channel to her crew. "All hands, this is the captain. We've seen what our enemy is capable of. Now they're going to see what we're capable of. We're going hunting."
The response from her crew was immediate and unanimous, a roar of agreement that would have chilled the blood of any alien observer. It was the sound of a species remembering its true nature, of predators preparing to hunt, of warriors awakening from a sleep that had lasted centuries. The galaxy was about to learn why the ancients had issued their warnings, and why those warnings had gone unheeded for far too long. The Zolonian war fleet emerged from hyperspace with the precision that had made them the galaxy's premier military force for over 3 millennia. Admiral Vexar stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, watching as 67 vessels arranged themselves in perfect formation. Each ship represented the pinnacle of galactic military technology, energy shields that could deflect stellar radiation, weapons capable of cracking planets, and armor forged from materials harder than diamond. For 2 weeks, the Zolonian fleet had been tracking the mysterious attackers responsible for the human colony massacres. Intelligence suggested the perpetrators were a rogue faction of hegemony separatists using stolen military hardware to provoke conflicts throughout the frontier regions. The Zolonians had volunteered to assist in hunting down these criminals as a gesture of goodwill toward their human trading partners. At least, that was the official story.
Admiral Vexar's true mission was far more complex.
The Zolonian High Command had grown increasingly concerned about humanity's reaction to the colony attacks. Intelligence reports described a mobilization effort that defied all logical parameters, an entire civilization transforming itself for war with a speed and efficiency that suggested long-prepared contingencies. The official goal was to capture the rogue attackers before humanity could mount its own retaliatory strike. Unofficially, Vexar had orders to assess human military capabilities and determine whether the ancient precursor warnings might have merit. "Admiral," reported his tactical officer, "long-range sensors detect multiple human vessels in the adjacent system. Configuration suggests they're conducting search operations." Vexar studied the display. 3 human ships moving in a standard search pattern, their crude sensors sweeping space for any trace of their enemies. The vessels looked exactly as described in intelligence briefings, functional but unimpressive, built with the utilitarian aesthetic that characterized human engineering.
"Signal the fleet," Vexar commanded.
"We'll coordinate our search with the human vessels. This will provide an excellent opportunity to observe their capabilities firsthand." What the Admiral didn't know was that the 3 human ships weren't conducting a random search. Captain Sarah Chen had been analyzing the attack patterns on the murdered colonies, and her tactical officer had identified a probable staging area where the attackers might have established a temporary base. The UES Prometheus and her escorts were moving to investigate. "Captain," Lieutenant Commander Jackson reported, "sensors are picking up a massive fleet signature. Zolonian configuration, 60-plus vessels."
Sarah frowned.
The Zolonians were allies, but their presence here seemed oddly convenient.
"Open a channel to their flagship."
Admiral Vexar's scale features appeared on the main screen, his expression carefully neutral.
"Captain Chen, I presume. I am Admiral Vexar of the Zolonian Imperial Fleet.
We have come to assist in hunting the criminals responsible for attacking your colonies. Appreciated, Admiral, Sarah replied, though something in his tone bothered her. We're investigating a possible staging area in the Kepler 438 system.
Intelligence suggests the attackers may have established a base there. Indeed?
Our own analysts reached similar conclusions.
Perhaps we should coordinate our investigations?
Sarah nodded, but privately wondered why one of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations needed to coordinate with 3 human ships to search a single system. The Zolonian fleet alone possessed more firepower than most species' entire militaries. 2 hours later, both fleets emerged in the Kepler 438 system to find their suspicions confirmed. A massive military installation orbited the system's third planet, clearly of recent construction and heavily fortified. The base bristled with weapons emplacements and shield generators, while dozens of ships moved in defensive patterns around its perimeter. "By the void," whispered Commander Thekvar, Vexhar's second in command.
"That's a full military fortress, not some temporary hideout. Who has the resources to build something like that without being detected?"
Admiral Vexhar studied the tactical displays with growing unease. The fortress was massive, easily capable of housing thousands of ships and supporting a population in the hundreds of thousands. More disturbing were the ship configurations he could identify. They weren't stolen hegemony vessels as intelligence had suggested. They were ships from dozens of different species, all flying under the same banner.
"Admiral," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving a transmission from the fortress."
"Put it through." The being that appeared on screen was unlike anything in Vexhar's experience. Tall and gaunt, with features that seemed to shift between different species characteristics, it wore robes that shimmered with an oily, unnatural light. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made Zolonian combat veterans step back from their stations. "Welcome, Admiral Vexhar and Captain Chen," the being said, somehow knowing exactly who it was addressing.
"I am Architect Mordaven of the Synthesis. Your arrival was anticipated." Sarah felt every instinct she possessed screaming warnings. "Synthesis? I've never heard of that organization."
Mordaven's features shifted into what might have been a smile. "We are new to your awareness, Captain, though we have observed your species for quite some time. The recent tests of human resolve were necessary to confirm certain theories about your people's potential." The temperature on both bridges seemed to drop several degrees.
Admiral Vexhar's tactical displays were showing hundreds of additional ship signatures emerging from concealment throughout the system.
They had walked into a carefully prepared trap.
"Tests?" Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge that made her bridge crew check their weapon systems. "You're responsible for murdering 4 million civilians?"
"Murder is such a crude term," Mordaven replied, his shifting features expressing something like amusement. "We prefer to think of it as empirical research. You see, the galaxy has grown complacent over millennia of peace. Species have forgotten what they're truly capable of when pressed to their limits.
The synthesis seeks to remind them." Admiral Vexhar activated his fleet's defensive systems while maintaining the communication link. "What are you saying, creature?" Mordaven's attention shifted to the Zolonian admiral.
"You, Admiral, represent the pinnacle of galactic military evolution. Your civilization has perfected the art of warfare through technology and doctrine. Your fleets are unmatched in their efficiency and firepower." He paused, his features cycling through expressions from dozens of different species.
"But you have forgotten something crucial. You fight to win, not to survive.
You calculate acceptable losses and strategic withdrawals. You surrender when the costs exceed the benefits.
These are the habits of a successful civilization." Sarah was beginning to understand the implications of what they were facing.
"You're testing whether civilized species still remember how to fight for survival."
"Exactly, Captain."
"Your species passed the first test admirably. The speed of your mobilization, the unity of your response, the willingness to abandon profitable trade relationships to hunt your enemies, all very promising indicators."
Admiral Vexhar's scales were beginning to show the color patterns that indicated extreme stress among his people. "You're insane. Galactic civilization exists because we've moved beyond primitive survival responses. Have you, Admiral?"
Mordaven's voice carried mocking tones.
"Let us find out."
The fortress and its escort fleets opened fire simultaneously, turning the space around them into a storm of energy beams and projectiles.
The Zolonian fleet responded with practiced efficiency, their shields absorbing the initial barrage while their weapons began systematically targeting enemy vessels. For several minutes, the battle proceeded exactly as naval doctrine predicted. The Zolonians, despite being outnumbered 3-1, maintained formation and inflicted steady casualties on their attackers. Their superior technology and training were clearly visible as enemy ships fell to precisely coordinated strikes. Admiral Vexhar began to feel confident. Signal the human vessels to withdraw to safe distance. This engagement exceeds their capabilities. But Captain Sarah Chen was discovering that her capabilities might be very different from what anyone expected. As she watched Zolonian ships beginning to take damage from the sheer volume of enemy fire, something fundamental shifted in her tactical thinking. "Jackson," she said, her voice carrying a tone her crew had never heard before, "patch me through to the Stalingrad and Churchill." "Aye, Captain." The faces of Captain Morrison and Captain Rodriguez appeared on her screen, both showing the same grim determination she felt building in her chest. "Orders, Captain?" Morrison asked. He was technically senior, but all three understood that Chen had become the focal point for something larger than rank or protocol. Sarah studied the tactical display, watching as the methodical Zolonian formations began to buckle under sustained assault. She could see exactly what the enemy was doing, forcing the technologically superior Zolonians to fight a battle of attrition where numbers would eventually prevail. "They want to see how we fight when we can't win," she said quietly. "Let's show them." What happened next would be analyzed by military theorists for centuries. Instead of maintaining defensive formations or attempting to withdraw, the three human ships accelerated directly toward the enemy fortress. They ignored the concentrated fire being directed at them, their primitive shields flaring and failing as they pressed forward. Admiral Vexhar watched in horror as the UES Prometheus took hit after hit, her hull glowing red with absorbed energy, atmosphere bleeding from multiple breaches. By all rational calculations, Captain Chen should have ordered withdrawal minutes ago. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in absolute chaos. Representatives from hundreds of species filled the Great Chamber on Zephyria Prime, their voices creating a cacophony of fear, anger, and desperate speculation. The formal protocols that had governed galactic politics for millennia had collapsed in the face of a threat none of them understood. Ambassador Kefvar stood at the podium, his ceremonial robes disheveled from 3 sleepless days of emergency meetings. Around him, the chamber buzzed with fragments of conversation in dozens of languages, reports of missing fleets, colonies going silent, and, most disturbing of all, human forces moving through space with a methodical fury that terrified even their allies. "Order!" Kefvar called, his voice amplified throughout the chamber. "We must have order." Slowly, the chaos subsided, but the fear remained palpable. Trade Minister Veltar of the Commerce Syndicate was the first to speak, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "Honored delegates," Veltar began, his skin showing the pale yellow of extreme stress, "in the past week, 17 commercial convoys have vanished without trace. The attacks are spreading beyond the frontier. Major trade routes are being abandoned. The galactic economy is collapsing." Commander ZYX of the Hegemony Military Council clicked his mandibles in agitation. "It's worse than economic disruption. 3 of our patrol fleets have encountered human battle groups in neutral space. They weren't attacking us, they were hunting. Moving in formation patterns I've never seen before, using tactics that make no sense by conventional standards." Captain Mordek's reptilian features showed deep concern. "We intercepted human military transmissions. They're not following standard fleet doctrines anymore. Each ship operates as if it's the last human vessel in the galaxy, expected to fight until destruction rather than accept defeat." Ambassador Kefvar felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. 3 weeks had passed since the fortress battle where human ships had demonstrated their willingness to achieve victory through mutual annihilation. Since then, humanity had transformed into something the galaxy had never seen, an entire civilization mobilized for total war. "What intelligence do we have about this synthesis organization?" he asked. Admiral Fex's crystalline form chimed with discord. "Very little. They appear from nowhere, test a species' response to existential threats, then vanish. But their pattern is becoming clear, they're selecting civilizations that show specific characteristics under pressure." "What characteristics?" demanded Captain Mordek. "The ability to fight beyond rational limits," Admiral Fex replied. "Species that become more dangerous as they approach defeat rather than seeking accommodation or surrender." The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in.
The synthesis wasn't randomly attacking civilizations, they were identifying species capable of the kind of desperate, total warfare that had once characterized the galaxy's most primitive eras. Keeper of Ancient Records approached the podium, her elderly form moving with the gravity of someone carrying terrible knowledge. "I have discovered additional precursor texts," she announced. "They provide context for what we're witnessing." She activated the chamber's display system, showing symbols that hurt to look at directly. The precursors called it the winnowing, a process by which civilizations are tested to determine their fitness for survival against threats from beyond our galaxy. Trade Minister Veltar's tentacles writhed nervously. Beyond our galaxy? What could threaten the entire galaxy? The precursors were never clear about the nature of the threat, the Keeper replied. But their record suggests that periodically, something comes from the dark spaces between galaxies, something that requires civilizations capable of total warfare to resist. Species that have grown too comfortable, too civilized, too dependent on rational solutions simply cannot survive the encounter. Commander ZYX leaned forward. "Are you suggesting that humanity was selected specifically because of their capacity for irrational warfare?" "Not irrational," the Keeper corrected. "Humanity's response appears irrational only because we judge it by civilized standards. But, if the threat requires species willing to sacrifice everything to ensure their enemy's defeat, then, humanity's response is perfectly logical." Ambassador Kethvar studied the ancient symbols with growing dread. What happened to species that failed these tests? The Keeper's expression grew grave. They were incorporated into the synthesis. Their populations, their technology, their unique capabilities all absorbed into a collective that serves the testing process. The chamber erupted in discussion as delegates realized they were facing not just random attacks, but a systematic evaluation that would determine their species' survival. The comfortable galaxy of trade agreements and diplomatic negotiations was being replaced by something far more primitive and dangerous. Captain Mordek's forked tongue flicked out, tasting the chemical traces of fear in the air. What about humanity? Are they allies in this conflict, or have they become part of the problem? Before anyone could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the station. Emergency broadcasts flooded the communication networks as reports arrived of massive fleet movements throughout the galaxy. The synthesis was moving to the next phase of their plan. Meanwhile, in the Sol system, President Elena Vesquez stood in the Strategic Command Center, surrounded by displays showing the deployment of humanity's war fleets. In 3 weeks, Earth's industrial capacity had been completely transformed. Orbital shipyards that had built cargo vessels now produced warships. Mining stations had become weapons factories. Even civilian transport ships had been refitted with military hardware. But, most disturbing to outside observers was the change in humanity's fundamental approach to galactic relations. The species that had spent centuries carefully avoiding conflicts and seeking diplomatic solutions had embraced total warfare with an enthusiasm that bordered on frightening. Admiral Sarah Hayes approached the president with the latest intelligence reports. "Madam President, our hunter-killer groups have tracked down and eliminated 43 synthesis staging areas. But, for every base we destroy, 2 more appear." President Vasquez studied the tactical displays showing human fleets spread throughout known space. "They're testing our endurance, seeing if we'll exhaust ourselves hunting shadows. What's our ship production status? Exceeding all projections. We're launching new vessels faster than we're losing them. More importantly, combat experience is teaching us to be more effective." Admiral Hayes paused. "But, there's something else, Madam President. Something our enemies may not have anticipated." "What's that, Admiral?" "Other species are beginning to request alliance with our forces. The Zolonians want joint operations. Even the normally neutral Centauri Federation is asking for protection. They've realized that whatever the synthesis represents, humanity seems to be the only species responding effectively." President Vasquez turned to face the displays showing the locations of Earth's colonies, each one now defended by battle fleets that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. "Are we winning, Admiral?" "That depends on how you define victory, Madam President. We're protecting our people and eliminating threats. But, the synthesis seems to have unlimited resources. This could continue indefinitely." "Then, we'll continue indefinitely," Vasquez replied without hesitation. "However long it takes, whatever the cost, we don't stop until our people are safe." Admiral Hayes nodded, recognizing the same implacable determination that had driven Captain Chen and her crews to sacrifice themselves rather than accept defeat. It was spreading through humanity like a virus, the absolute refusal to surrender regardless of odds or costs. On the bridge of the UES Vengeance, Captain Marcus Torres was discovering what that determination meant in practice. His ship was one of the new generation of human warships, built not for exploration or trade, but for a single purpose: finding and destroying humanity's enemies. "Captain," reported his tactical officer, "long-range sensors detect a synthesis fleet. 47 vessels, moving toward the Tau Ceti colonies." Torres studied the tactical display. The enemy fleet outgunned his single ship by overwhelming odds, but that was no longer a consideration in human military planning. Since the fortress battle, human commanders had learned to think in terms of acceptable casualties rather than acceptable risks. "Signal Fleet Command," Torres ordered. "Enemy contact at Grid 77 Alpha. Estimate arrival at Tau Ceti in 6 hours." "Sir," his communications officer reported, "Fleet Command acknowledges. Admiral Chen's task force is 12 hours away. Orders are to shadow and harass until reinforcements arrive." Torres smiled grimly. Admiral Chen was the sister of the captain who had died destroying the first synthesis fortress. Like many human commanders, she had taken her family's sacrifice personally. "Helm, intercept course. All hands to battle stations." As the Vengeance accelerated toward an enemy fleet that could destroy her with ease, Torres reflected on how much his species had changed. 3 months ago, engaging 47 enemy ships with one vessel would have been called suicide. Now it was called duty. The transformation hadn't been limited to military thinking. Human civilian populations had embraced wartime conditions with an enthusiasm that shocked galactic observers. Families sent their children to military academies. Scientists abandoned peaceful research for weapons development. Artists created propaganda that inspired rather than entertained. Most disturbing to other species was humanity's apparent comfort with the new reality. They weren't fighting to return to the peaceful galaxy they had known, they were fighting to create a galaxy where threats to human civilians would be met with overwhelming retaliation. As the Vengeance closed with the enemy fleet, Torres opened a channel to his crew. "All hands, this is the captain. We're about to engage superior numbers, but remember, we're not trying to win this battle. We're trying to make the enemy pay such a high price for victory that they'll think twice before attacking our colonies." The response from his crew was immediate and unanimous, a roar of agreement that would have terrified any alien observer. It was the sound of a species that had rediscovered its capacity for total warfare, and found that they not only remembered how to fight without hope of victory, but actually preferred it to the compromises of peace. The galaxy was about to learn that the precursor's warnings hadn't been metaphorical. Humanity's fury, once awakened, really was something that consumed all reason, all calculation, all hope of negotiated settlement. And it was spreading to every human ship, every human colony, every human settlement in known space. The ancients had fled rather than face it. The synthesis was about to discover they had made a terrible mistake in believing they could control it. The war for galactic survival was entering its deadliest phase, and humanity had just announced their terms: victory or mutual annihilation, with no middle ground acceptable. The final confrontation began not with fanfare or formal declarations, but with silence. Throughout the galaxy, the constant chatter of commerce, diplomacy, and peaceful communication simply stopped. Trade routes became highways for war fleets. Diplomatic channels carried only ultimatums and battle reports. The comfortable civilization that had existed for millennia was dying, replaced by something far older and more primal. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution, flagship of humanity's first fleet, watching the largest armada in galactic history assemble around her. 2,000 human warships hung in space above Earth, their hulls scarred from months of constant warfare, their crews hardened by battles that had claimed millions of lives. But these weren't the same humans who had timidly explored space 3 centuries earlier. These were the inheritors of a fury that had slept for generations, awakened by the murder of innocents and forged into something that even the precursors would have recognized. "Admiral," reported Captain Torres from the UES Vengeance, "forward scouts confirm intelligence reports. The synthesis has assembled their entire fleet at the galactic core. They're not hiding anymore." Chen studied the tactical displays showing the enemy formation. Over 10,000 vessels of every conceivable design, unified only by the dark energy signatures that marked them as part of the synthesis collective. At their center lay something that defied description, a construct larger than most space stations, pulsing with energies that made reality itself seem unstable around it. "They're done testing," Chen realized aloud.
"Whatever they've been preparing for, it's beginning." Her communication officer nodded grimly. "We're receiving similar reports from Allied fleets throughout the galaxy. Zolonian, Hegemony, Centauri, everyone is mobilizing." "But, Admiral, the numbers." Chen understood. Even with every galactic civilization united, they were outnumbered 5-1. By conventional military thinking, the war was already lost. But humanity had abandoned conventional thinking months ago. President Vasquez's voice filled the bridge as she addressed the assembled fleet. "Soldiers of Earth, defenders of humanity, you are about to enter the final battle for our survival. The enemy believes they can test us, judge us, determine whether we deserve to exist. They are about to learn that some questions should never be asked." Throughout the fleet, human crews listened with the same grim determination that had characterized their species' response to every crisis in the past months. They were no longer fighting for victory in any traditional sense. They were fighting for the right to exist without permission, to raise their children without fear, to face the universe on their own terms rather than accept judgment from entities that viewed entire civilizations as test subjects. "All ships," Admiral Chen broadcast to the assembled fleet, "you know your orders. We advance together. We fight together. If necessary, we die together. But, whatever happens, we ensure that the enemy remembers this day for the rest of their existence." The human fleet began its final journey toward the galactic core, moving through space with the methodical precision of a species that had learned to think of warfare not as a tool of politics, but as an expression of fundamental principles that couldn't be compromised. Behind them, throughout human space, the transformation was complete. Every orbital station had become a fortress. Every civilian transport had been armed. Every human settlement had prepared for siege. The species that had once prided itself on peaceful exploration had embraced total warfare with a completeness that shocked even their allies. At the galactic core, architect Mordaven watched the approaching fleets with something approaching satisfaction. The winnowing was proceeding exactly as designed. Species throughout the galaxy had been tested, their capabilities assessed, their willingness to embrace necessary brutality measured. Most had failed. The Commerce Syndicate had collapsed when their trade networks were disrupted. The hegemony had fragmented when their client species refused to accept military conscription. Even the mighty Zolonians had proven too dependent on technological superiority to adapt when faced with enemies willing to sacrifice everything for victory. But humanity had exceeded all expectations. They had demonstrated not just the willingness to fight without hope of victory, but the capacity to transform their entire civilization for war without losing their essential character. They fought with desperate fury, but also with careful strategy. They accepted terrible casualties, but also learned from each defeat. They were exactly what the synthesis needed. "Begin the final phase," Mordaven commanded. Around him, the massive construct at the center of the synthesis fleet began to pulse with energies that reached across dimensional barriers. "Open the barriers. Let them come." Space itself began to tear around the galactic core. Reality cracked like broken glass, revealing glimpses of something vast and hungry moving in the darkness between galaxies. The threat that the precursors had faced 50,000 years ago was returning, and it was far worse than any galactic civilization could imagine. But, as the barriers weakened and ancient hungers stirred in the void, the human fleet arrived like an avalanche of fury and determination. Admiral Chen saw the tears in space, saw the shadows moving beyond reality, and understood what they were really fighting. "All ships," she broadcast, her voice carrying calm certainty that spread through the fleet like wildfire, "target the construct. Whatever it takes." The battle that followed would be remembered as long as civilization existed. 10,000 synthesis vessels met 2,000 human ships and their galactic allies in a conflict that turned space itself into a storm of energy and debris. Ships died by the hundreds, their crews accepting destruction rather than retreat. But the humans fought differently. Instead of trying to win through superior firepower or tactics, they fought to ensure their enemy paid an unacceptable price for victory. Every human ship that died took multiple enemy vessels with it. Every human pilot who faced inevitable death aimed their dying craft at critical enemy systems. Most importantly, they adapted. As the battle progressed and casualties mounted, human commanders began to recognize patterns in the synthesis collective behavior.
The enemy fought with overwhelming numbers but limited creativity. They could absorb massive losses but struggled to adjust when familiar tactics failed. Captain Torres, his ship burning around him, made the connection that changed everything. "Admiral," he broadcast, his voice barely audible through static, "they're not individual ships, they're components of a larger system. The construct is controlling them all." Chen understood immediately. The synthesis wasn't a confederation of different species, it was a single entity using thousands of bodies. Destroy the central control system, and the entire fleet would collapse. "All ships, new target priority," she ordered. "Ignore the escort vessels. Everything we have at the construct." What followed was the largest coordinated suicide attack in galactic history. Every human ship, damaged or intact, turned toward the massive construct and began their final approach. They ignored the defensive fire that consumed dozens of vessels every second. They ignored the impossibility of their mission. They simply flew straight toward their target with the absolute determination to complete their objective or die trying. Admiral Chen's flagship was among the first to reach the construct's defensive perimeter. The Retribution's hull was glowing white-hot from absorbed energy, her crew fighting fires in a dozen compartments, but she pressed forward with the inevitability of a natural disaster. "This is for New Geneva," Chen said quietly as she aimed her dying ship at the construct's central core. "This is for every human child who died while we tried to be civilized." The Retribution detonated her entire arsenal inside the construct's primary control center, creating a chain reaction that spread through the artificial entity like a disease. Other human ships followed, each sacrifice weakening the enemy's coordination until their vast fleet began to collapse into chaos. But, even as the construct died, the tears in space continued to widen. Ancient things began to emerge from the void between galaxies, entities that viewed entire civilizations as food, that consumed meaning and purpose as well as matter and energy. The real war was just beginning. Architect Mordaven, his hybrid form beginning to dissolve as the construct failed, made one final transmission: "You have passed the test, humans. You have proven you can fight without hope, sacrifice without reservation, endure without compromise. The galaxy will need these qualities in the war to come." As his consciousness faded, Mordaven felt something like pride. The Winnowing had identified the species capable of defending reality itself against threats from beyond the galactic rim. Humanity had earned their place as guardians of civilization not through superior technology or greater numbers, but through their absolute refusal to surrender in the face of extinction. Admiral Chen, her ship dying around her, watched the last synthesis vessels fall to the combined galactic fleet. The construct was gone, its controlling intelligence destroyed, but the tears in space remained. Through those gaps, she could see vast shapes moving in the darkness, the true enemy that the synthesis had been preparing the galaxy to fight. "All ships," she broadcast to the surviving human fleet, "this is Admiral Chen. We have won this battle, but the war is just beginning. Something is coming that makes everything we've faced look like a training exercise." She paused, looking around her bridge at the crew members who had followed her through months of impossible battles. They were exhausted, wounded, some probably dying, but their eyes still burned with the fury that had carried them through every previous crisis. "But, whatever comes next," Chen continued, "they're going to learn the same lesson the synthesis learned. They're going to learn why the precursors fled rather than face humanity's wrath. They're going to discover that some species don't fight to win, they fight to make their enemies pay such a terrible price for victory that defeat becomes preferable." Throughout the galaxy, species that had survived the Winnowing began the long process of rebuilding their civilizations. But they rebuilt them differently this time, learning from humanity's example that true strength came not from superior technology or careful diplomacy, but from the absolute refusal to accept defeat when core principles were threatened. The ancients had warned about humanity's fury, and their warnings had gone unheeded until it was almost too late. But now the galaxy understood what the precursors had learned 50,000 years ago, that among all the species that reached for the stars, only a few possessed the fundamental willingness to fight for their existence without reservation or compromise. As new threats emerged from the void between galaxies, the galaxy prepared to face them with a weapon the precursors had never possessed: humans who remembered their true nature and allied species who had learned to fight with the same desperate determination. The war for reality itself was about to begin, and humanity had just taught the galaxy how to wage it.